Welcome. This is the 2018 education program for the Intercountry Adoption Family Support Service here at LifeWorks. I have with me today Susan Gregory and Narelle Nellis, who will be presenting a series of conversations that have been very helpful for families who have been formed by intercountry adoption.
Thanks, Gianna. Well, in part today came about because Gianna and I were having a discussion. That discussion was really about the sorts of things that families keep coming back to us with time after time. So as Gianna knows, Narelle and I have been in business for a long time and working with intercountry adoption for a long time. And there are some regular themes that keep coming up all the time, and I thought it probably would be really useful if we could talk about what those themes were, how they present, and then be able to pass that on to families that we work with. So one of the big things that we're going to start with really is the idea of shame in adoption and how that impacts in families and also how that impacts for adult adopted people as well. A lot of parents have got fairly well educated, and so they're fairly well educated around things like attachment, around trauma. You know, they're doing really good work around that, but I find that shame is one of the things that they don't often consider that their children carry, and a lot of their behaviour management techniques actually reinforce a sense of shame. And so I think it's really important that parents understand that and understand that sometimes the more traditional ways of parenting are actually reinforcing children's sense of shame. And so we need to have that real shift in the way that they're managing kids' behaviour because they already come with that at the base. So a slide that we're going to be putting up for you now, you'll be able to see that it actually says that shame is internalised when one is abandoned. And let's face it, for most children who are adopted, abandonment is the first thing that has occurred to them. And I think it's just that sense that we are wired to belong to our biological caregivers, and so it's sort of in our DNA that it is there, and that when that doesn't occur, then that's what it means by it being internalized. How does a human brain make sense of the fact that I don't actually belong and I'm being cared for by my biological parent? And so, you know, as infants, they do very much take on this sense that if I'm not with my biological parents, then I must be inherently flawed. And so that's at the base for most children, isn't it,
Yes.
who are adopted. And certainly with the work that I do with adult adopted people, they can well recognise when we start having these conversations that this has been something that they carry throughout their life. So that first one is that shame is internalised when they're abandoned, and really what they end up saying to themselves is that I'm flawed and defective as a human being. That's what toxic shame ends up saying to them. There must be something intrinsically wrong with me.
How is it expressed at different stages of their lives? Is that something that you've been able to identify? The behaviour that someone might see as a parent of, let's say, start with maybe a newly arrived child that they've adopted. How can you give us some idea of what that might look like when, as you point out, as an adult you might be able to really start to understand and recognise and articulate and say, yes, I just don't feel confident at work, I don't have a sense of myself of being important or have an entitlement to a happy life. But children can't often speak with that language. How do you see it manifest?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I suppose one of the ways I see it mostly being manifested in children do a sense of covering up who they are, and that's a really big one where they're not always being their true self, and having all these tools around them to cover up so that people won't see that what they believe is there, that they are flawed inside. And
that's interesting, cover up. What do you mean by cover up?
A young man that I was working with once would tell everybody about his grandiose plans for the future, when in reality his anxiety got in the way of him even attending school. So he would present to the world a perfect picture of how he looked, and always very well groomed, and looking as though everything was just perfect in his life, where in reality he struggled to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
And we will actually probably pop up a couple of slides on that. The slide that you're seeing now, some adoptees believe that they must be guilty of something, or that their mothers would not have left them. So it must be who we are. That's what they're saying to themselves. And, when you think adoption for most of these children occur early in life, and that's when children are intrinsically egocentric, and so everything must be about them. It must be something that they have done.
Yes.
So, there are some events for us that seem so unfathomable that we do take on some kind of responsibility for them, because otherwise they defy explanation in the human brain. So there's no place in the infant's psyche for that understanding of a mother leaving the baby. And out of that chaos and confusion that follows the separation, the baby's mind conjures up a reason. And so that reason is often about themselves. Somehow I must be at fault, and I am flawed. And that's a thing that's really, really hard for adoptive parents to be able to hear. And it does, it creates great sadness. I mean, there's a lot of tears around that.
Because they work so hard on making sure they have a strong self-esteem and that they feel good about themselves. And this is right at the core of their whole being, that has nothing to do with how they've been in the adoptive family. It's something that is at the base of adoption.
I think it's interesting just for us to be able to work out how shame is different from guilt.
Now that is really interesting, because on the slide that you'll see up on your screen now, it talks about, guilt is what we feel when we break a rule, but shame is something that we feel about our core and ourself. It's not that a rule has been broken, and it's words like I'm stupid and it's my fault that come into play here. So guilt is I made a mistake, whereas shame is I am a mistake, and I am bad. And I suppose it reminds me of working with a 12-year-old girl once, and this comment has forever stuck in my mind, that she said to me, I am a nobody's nothing. And I think that's what we're talking about with shame, that feeling that goes to her core of who she is, and that's what she's carrying. And we were only seeing it in her behaviour, but for her to be able to articulate that was,
So if it was a younger child, say a 3-year-old, because by what you're describing, this is something that becomes core to their being, as you put it, from the moment that they are abandoned. And then over time it manifests and shows itself in different ways according to the developmental stages. So let's say it's a 3-year-old. How would you see, what kind of behaviour would you see from a 3-year-old? What's your experience of the behaviour? Because often parents, that's what would bring them to our service and to come and see both of you, is because there's something about the child's behaviour that they don't understand, or they've tried every technique and it hasn't worked, or so how would it show itself up so that parents who don't quite know about this yet can sort of pin it to, that's why my child is doing this or...
It's hard to differentiate from other behaviours, and I think that's where it's really tricky to actually say, that's a shame-based behaviour and this is a regular behaviour. But I think what the key is that as parents of children with shame as their core, and as people working in that area, we just really need to be aware that is somehow sort of a given that children come with. And so in our management style of any behaviours that we're seeing, that we really need to be mindful of that, in that we're not reinforcing the shame. So we're not going to be able to sort of say, whoa, that behaviour is definitely a shame-based behaviour, but we do know it's at the core of adoption.
Yeah.
So we want to be really careful that when we're handling any behaviours, whether it be as a result of shame or just a regular behaviour, that we don't reinforce the shame that's underlying.
I think one of the big things for me, just as I'm listening to what Narelle was saying there too, one of the big differences when she was talking about her client, the 12-year-old, the I'm nobody's nothing type comment. I mean, it goes straight to our heart, but even more it goes to the heart of the parents to imagine that their child is thinking this about themselves. So there is often a lot of cover-up for children in relation to what they present to their parents. So I guess one of the things that I hope that parents do understand about this is that this is what their children carry. It's important that they are aware of this, because their kids can't give it voice to them often.
No, that's right.
And so we need them to be able to be strong enough within themselves to understand and accept that exists for their children.
What you're saying, I think, is when something is being presented to them by this child, and they feel at a loss as to how to manage it or what's going on, that's something in the background for them to consider.
Yes.
In how they manage the behaviour.
Yeah, this child
to
isn't
ensure not to
necessarily
reinforce it.
Yeah, and this child isn't necessarily doing this because of this, or to hurt me or upset me or manipulate me or all the sorts of things that parents often try and make sense of.
Yes.
So that where does this sit within that idea?
Yeah. And I guess a lot of the time what we do want people to be able to do is be able to, in that moment with their children, do that shift into empathy, and being able to, because that really is the greatest antidote for shame, is to remain empathic with that. Whereas there's a lot of behaviours that children will present that trigger off things for us as a parent, where empathy goes out the window and we go straight into managing the behaviour, and
in the
that's
traditional way.
Yeah, all of those traditional things.
Yeah.
And really, traditional parenting is a lot about blaming and guilting. There is a lot about that goes into it. And of course, kids like this who come with this template, this history that adoptive parents can't do anything about, they're coming with this. It is part of who they are. But if they overlay it with, doing these traditional parenting techniques, you can see that they are actually reinforcing something that their children have come with.
Yes.
And so that's why that traditional parenting style, and indeed our education system a lot of times, doesn't work. The way that they're managed in schools doesn't work. It reinforces these children's shame all the time, and it actually just digs them deeper. And so that's what parents will say, no matter what we do, nothing is changing with their behaviour. Well, we're not actually dealing with the real issue. And so that's the really important thing that I work with parents to be able to get them to understand, is where this potentially is coming from all the time. So the slide that you've got up now is just talking a little bit about toxic shame. And Narelle was talking just before about how there is the cover-up self. So shame, when it gets transformed into an identity, becomes toxic and dehumanizing. It becomes unbearable, and it always necessitates a cover-up. And so certainly when people have got to adulthood who've been adopted, they recognise this really well. They recognise that they often are living a life with a false self and a cover-up self. Since you feel that your true self is defective and flawed, you need a false self that doesn't seem to be defective and flawed. And so often that sort of grandiose thing comes in. Often the perfectionistic tendencies come in for them then, that we've got to work so hard at being this other self because the true self isn't acceptable. And they often do feel that if that person didn't know, if my parent didn't know their true self, they sure as hell wouldn't love me either, because my birth parent didn't.
Yeah.
And so this is what's going on behind that all the time. And we've just put a slide up now that adoptive parents can be seen as their heroes in this scenario, and it's really important. And I'm not saying that adoptive parents do this themselves, but there is a lot of other people in society will say, oh, how good you are to have taken this child in. And a lot of parents do get that from the outside world to them. that they've rescued this baby, and that the baby had to be rescued is additional proof that she is flawed then, if the children are hearing that scenario.
Okay.
So there is a real need for the adoptee to keep the parents from discovering the bad baby and try to be somebody else. So that also, that societal thing feeds into it for them as well. And so that feeling is reinforced by the child not being mirrored in the adoptive family, because the adoptive parents are genetically different from their child.
Yes.
Then they can't mirror him as well as he might be mirrored by his biological family. So that's that real face-to-face stuff at that pivotal neurological time when functionally the brain needs that eye-to-eye absolute adoration from their carer. That point has already gone for a child who might have gone into institutional care at that time, so it was never done for them. And so you can see how neurologically they're coming from a place where functionally it hasn't happened at a time when it needed to happen. And so that's another thing that is useful for parents to understand. Again, it's nothing that adoptive parents have done. This is just the reality of what their children bring. They can't change the history. Often the brain is a historical organ. It stores everything that's happened to it, and they can't change the fact that this child was abandoned. They can't change the fact that they were put in institutional care. All of those sorts of things. So whatever they're going to be doing, they have to be overlaying that and accept that that is still always there. Okay, so another way of understanding this is that a shame-based person will guard against exposing their inner self to others, but more significantly, they often will guard against exposing it themselves to themselves. So there's a lot of cover-up, and that's where for a lot of adult adopted people who come in to do this sort of work as well, timing has to be it has to be right for all counselling, but it definitely has to be right for adult adopted people as well, because there's a huge amount of courage that it takes to be able to do this
to be
work.
ready to actually let down that facade and go beyond the cover-up facade and look at what's really happening inside.
And I wonder if I can make a point here, because often the way that shame constructs itself in the adult can mean that to try and access counselling, it might take a few goes before.
Definitely.
And I guess I just wanted to point that out because I'm aware that there might be some adult adoptees who feel as though they've failed or didn't have the courage or the strength or to continue. And so that it's the timing. And it's also, it's never wasted to go and, unless you have a really dreadful experience, which would be awful, but to feel that, oh no, I'm getting too close to those painful feelings.
Or exposing
that cover up.
Letting my cover up
down. And so then they might disappear.
Sort of back away and then take another step and then back away.
Is a common experience, isn't it?
Very.
Absolutely.
Yeah.